Floor, and you know what I'm talking about here on my channel right now.
And yes, that's right. Today we're officially talking about the Blake Lively settlement talks, and I know the question everyone keeps asking the second they see those words next to each other is, does this mean Blake Lively and Baldoni are about to settle? Does this mean the whole thing is wrapping up quietly behind the scenes, papers signed, NDA slapped on, everyone walking away pretending none of this ever happened? No. It doesn't mean that at all. Not even close. What it actually means is that the judge has stepped in and said, enough posturing for now, you're at least going to sit down and go through the motions of settlement discussions, whether you like it or not. That's it. That's all this is. Mandatory talks, court-ordered, procedural. Nothing romantic about it, nothing conciliatory about it, nothing that suggests either side suddenly had a change of heart. We're going to break all of that down, exactly what was ordered, why it was ordered, and why this doesn't suddenly save Blake Lively from the position she's in right now. And we'll also get into a lot more today, because it's one of those days where the news just refuses to slow down. We've got Epstein Files news. Today is technically the day the government was supposed to release all of them, every last page, every last name, except surprise, they're not actually doing that. So what's really going on there? Are arrests coming? Are they stalling? Are they hiding something in plain sight? We'll get into that. We also have updates on the Brown University shooter. They found him. He's dead. And what's wild is how Reddit, of all places, played a role in helping law enforcement piece together what happened. And then, later, we'll talk about Rob Rayner and the absolutely tragic situation involving his family, something that has turned into a much darker story than anyone expected. So yeah, there's a lot to get into, and all of it starts right now on Coravanta. Let's dive straight into Blake Lively, because that's clearly where most of the attention is right now. And by the way, quick housekeeping before we go any further, I'll be doing a live stream tomorrow night. We're keeping it light, kind of a Christmas-themed stream. I'll be sharing some of the gifts I've received, hanging out, nothing heavy. 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you want to catch that, hit the alert bell, do all the YouTube things, you know the drill, alright. Here's what actually happened. During a video conference held on Monday, December 15th, the court issued a scheduling order in a case involving Blake Lively and Baldoni. And this is where people started jumping to conclusions without actually reading what the court said. The order lays out two separate, counsel-only conferences. One with counsel for the plaintiff, that's Blake Lively, scheduled for Friday, January 23rd at 10 a.m. Then a separate counsel-only conference with counsel for the defendant, Baldoni, scheduled that same day at 11:00 a.m. Notice something important there. They're not even meeting together. They're not sitting across from each other at a table. They're not hashing anything out face-to-face. They're talking to the court, separately. This is less let's settle this and more the judge wants to hear whether settlement is even remotely possible before we waste more court time. So if you're looking at this and thinking, oh wow, Blake Lively must be close to settling, I genuinely don't see the scenario. And if you do, I'd actually love to hear it, because I don't see where Baldoni benefits from settling at this point. He has her on the ropes. She's the plaintiff. She's the one who brought the accusations. She's the one who has to prove harassment. And so far, what have we actually seen? He yelled on set. I felt uncomfortable. Vibes. Feelings. No smoking gun. No corroborating evidence that rises to the level she's alleging. So what's the endgame here? Does Blake suddenly decide to say, you know what, maybe it wasn't harassment, maybe I interpreted it wrong? Because if that's the move, Baldoni still has to agree to it. And right now, there's zero incentive for him to do that. None. Especially after everything that's already been put into motion publicly. So yes, there's your update. Court-ordered settlement talks. Nothing more. Nothing less. And that's not even the end of the Blake Lively situation today, because there's more bubbling up around this case that's actually making things worse for her, not better. Enter Brandon Sleena. Now there's a headline floating around that says something like Brandon Sleena details online hate amid Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively lawsuit. And it's one of those classic pop culture headlines that sounds dramatic but doesn't really tell you what people are actually upset about. The article itself originally framed him as the man caught between Sydney Sweeney and Amanda Seyfried, which, look, I'm a happily married guy, but if we're being honest, being caught between Sydney Sweeney and Amanda Seyfried doesn't sound like the worst problem in the world. Stuck in an elevator, stranded on an island, keeping warm by a fire, alright, that got weird, moving on, but here's the point. Sleena says he carried a sense of looseness into his next project and found true acting joy for the first time. That project was It Ends With Us, which, ironically, turned out to be anything but joyful thanks to the ongoing legal war between his co-star Blake Lively and director Justin Baldoni. And people are already asking, will that statement get dragged into court? The fact that he said he found joy? Because here's the thing, if you found joy, why did you unfollow Baldoni? When I find joy, I don't usually start cutting people out of my life, as Lena says his visibility exploded even though he had a small role, and during the press tour he posted on Instagram asking fans to be kinder. He claims he wasn't attacking anyone, just asking people to focus on the ethos of the movie instead of tearing people down. He thought it was a nice message. Apparently, a lot of people didn't agree. The backlash came fast. Death threats. Career-ending threats. Ugly stuff, and look, none of that is okay. Full stop. But here's where the disconnect happens. That's not actually why people were upset with him. The real reason people turned on Selena was because of what he chose to amplify. He shared the New York Times complaint, Blake Lively's side, and he didn't just share it quietly. He captioned it with "For the love of God, read this," tagged Blake Lively, and added a heart. This wasn't neutral. This wasn't balanced. This was him publicly picking a side, loudly, early, before Baldoni had even fully responded, and here's where it starts to click for a lot of people. When you find out that Selena himself has said he landed roles because Blake Lively advocated for him, suddenly the loyalty makes sense. Suddenly the unfollowing makes sense. Suddenly why certain actors distance themselves from Baldoni becomes very clear. It wasn't moral outrage. It was career math, and that's the problem. Because when Baldoni eventually released his side, when he denied the claims and pushed back, Selena didn't say, "For the love of God, read this too." He went silent. And audiences notice that kind of thing. If you want people to believe you're acting from principle, you don't selectively amplify only one narrative. So when Selena says he doesn't understand why people were upset, that's why. It wasn't random. It wasn't mysterious. It wasn't just trolls being trolls. It was about fairness, or the lack of it, and this is where the Blake Lively orbit starts to look smaller than it used to. The so-called dragons around her? They're not breathing fire anymore. Taylor Swift, once firmly in that orbit, has very visibly moved on. New chapter. New relationship. Different priorities. That protective circle isn't what it once was, and that matters in an industry where perception is currency now. Speaking of Taylor Swift, yes, we're going there. Because one of the most interesting things right now isn't the drama itself, but how culture moves on from it. Taylor Swift's documentary series dropped its first 2 episodes last week, and the next 2 are out today. And love her or hate her, she knows how to tell a story. There's a moment in the documentary where her mother plays matchmaker between her and Travis Kelce, and it's honestly fascinating to watch how carefully her public narrative is managed. Kelce's version is great because it's so blunt. He thought being a star in Kansas City meant something. Turns out, it doesn't get you backstage with Taylor Swift. And the scale of her operation, taking over locker rooms, converting stadiums, reshaping cities, it's on another level. She doesn't just sell tickets. She alters economies. Entire local economies, and yes, I still believe there's no such thing as an ethical billionaire. I think Taylor Swift should be taxed more. But I also acknowledge that people choose to consume her art. That's different from monopolistic wealth extraction. Both things can be true at once. From a cultural powerhouse like that, the show pivots hard into tragedy with the Rob Reiner story. And this is where the tone shifts completely. Rob Reiner defending his son, talking about privilege, mental health, schizophrenia, addiction. It's heartbreaking. This isn't gossip. This is real human collapse. A family imploding under pressure, illness, and expectations, and then Nancy Grace comes in swinging with death penalty rhetoric, dressed like she's about to fight someone in a Starbucks parking lot, and suddenly the conversation becomes less about justice and more about spectacle. And I'm torn on the death penalty. I think it's archaic. I think it's lazy. I think there are more productive ways to handle even the worst offenders. But I also understand why people feel the way they feel when violence is this brutal. From there, the show pivots again: Brown University shooter, untraceable phones, financial obfuscation, Reddit cracking the case. And that's where part 1 will pause, because from here the Epstein files, the economy, inflation skepticism, healthcare, and the end-of-year wrap all deserve their own full expansion. Pivots again: Brown University shooter, untraceable phones, financial obfuscation, Reddit cracking the case. Because from here the Epstein files, the economy, inflation skepticism, healthcare, and the end-of-year wrap all deserve their own full expansion. So picking right back up where we left off, the Brown University shooting is one of those stories that just sits heavy no matter how you approach it. 2 students dead. An MIT professor dead. Lives cut short in ways that don't make sense and never will. And what's especially unsettling is how calculated the shooter seemed to be. This wasn't some impulsive act. This wasn't random chaos. He was using untraceable phones, avoiding credit cards tied to his name, and deliberately obscuring his digital footprint. He knew what he was doing. He knew how to hide. Federal agents eventually breached a storage locker in Salem, New Hampshire, looking for Claudio Neves Valente, a Portuguese national believed to be responsible for the Brown University killings and the MIT professor's murder in Brooklyn. By the time they closed in, he was already dead. Suicide. End of story, at least officially. No trial. No full accounting. No answers that actually feel satisfying, and yet, what cracks this whole thing open is how the trail didn't really come together through some cinematic FBI breakthrough. It came through Reddit. 3 days after the shooting, police received an anonymous tip pointing them to a Reddit post. The post was blunt. Direct. No hedging. It described a grey Nissan with Florida plates, possibly a rental, parked near a small outbuilding by the Rhode Island Historical Society. That car turned out to be key. Police went back through surveillance footage, found the vehicle, and that led them closer to Valente. A day later, the person who made the Reddit post voluntarily came forward and described an encounter with the suspect that now feels terrifying in hindsight. The guy looked out of place. Shabby clothes. Wrong for the weather. Pacing. Circling the block. A weird game of cat and mouse. At one point, the Reddit poster even confronted him, asking why he kept circling. Think about that for a second. You unknowingly confront a man who will go on to murder multiple people. That's not just unsettling, that's nightmare fuel. If you're that Reddit user, you didn't just dodge a metaphorical bullet. You quite literally dodged a real one. And while law enforcement ultimately closed in, the reality is they didn't stop him in time. 2 students and a professor still lost their lives. There's no victory here, just damage control, and that sense of living in a constant state of damage control kind of sums up the broader world we're in right now, because from there the show shifts into something that feels almost surreal, the Epstein files. Today was supposed to be the day. The deadline. The moment where everything comes out. Names. Flights. Associations. Documents. And once again, it didn't happen. The Department of Justice missed the deadline. No full release. No clear timeline. And what makes this especially absurd is that the delay puts the White House in direct conflict with a law signed by President Donald Trump himself back in November, mandating the release of these files. They passed the law. They set the date. And now they're saying, actually, not yet. We already know, from multiple sources, that hundreds of federal agents were assigned to comb through the Epstein files, specifically looking for where Trump's name appeared. That part is basically confirmed at this point. The question isn't whether his name is in there. It almost certainly is. The real question is whether there's a smoking gun. And from everything that's leaked so far, there probably isn't anything that ties Trump to the most explicit crimes in a way that's airtight, but that doesn't mean the files don't matter. Even without a smoking gun, even without video or photographs that end the debate forever, there's still the issue of truth versus narrative. Were there lies? Were there denials that don't hold up? Were there associations that were minimized or brushed aside? Catching someone in a lie matters, even if it doesn't land them in handcuffs. What makes the delay even more infuriating is the contrast. Journalist Sam Stein summed it up perfectly when he pointed out that it supposedly takes weeks or months to prepare the Epstein files for release, but somehow the Kennedy Center facade can be changed in a matter of hours. No vote. No debate. No transparency. Just a tarp over the John F. Kennedy Memorial Center, and suddenly Donald Trump's name is getting bolted onto it. The Donald Trump for John F. Kennedy Memorial Center. Say that out loud. It sounds ridiculous. Hey, want to go see a show tonight? Sure, let's head over to the Donald Trump John F. Kennedy Memorial Center. Or we could just go to AMC like normal people, and the point isn't just aesthetics. It's priorities. They can move mountains when it comes to ego and branding, but when it comes to accountability, suddenly everything slows down. None of this lowers grocery prices. None of this helps people pay rent. None of this makes avocados cheaper. It's pure distraction, which brings us to the economy, because this week the news claimed inflation is down. That should be good news. In theory. But does anyone actually believe these numbers anymore? They fired the guy in charge of job reports when the data didn't look good. They want to change how GDP is measured because technically, 2 quarters of flat or declining GDP equals a recession, and they don't want to call it that. Economists aren't buying it. Bond markets aren't buying it. Even major firms are side-eyeing the data. One economist flat out said, "Dude, that was one flawed report." Others politely called it a noisy print, which is economist speak for this data is a mess and we don't trust it. The reality is, when the government shuts down and can't even reliably track employment, people stop listening. They turn to private reports because at least those don't pretend everything is fine. People don't want spin. They want a simple answer, does the economy suck or not, and most people already know the answer when they go Christmas shopping. Tariffs aren't helping. Prices are still high. Wages aren't keeping up. You might know someone who had a great year. Hell, I had a great year. Best year I've ever had with the podcast. But that doesn't mean the average person is thriving. It just means anecdotes don't equal reality. Health insurance costs are going up. Mine's probably going to double. Are we any closer to universal healthcare? Ironically, I think we are, not because the system is improving, but because it's getting so bad that people can't ignore it anymore. When Americans start traveling to Mexico or Turkey for medical procedures because it's cheaper, something is broken. Healthcare tourism shouldn't be a necessity, people are opting out. Saying, "I'll take my chances." And that drives costs up even more for everyone else. It's a vicious cycle. And the wildest part is, this is all happening in a country that likes to brag about being the greatest in the world. Meanwhile, life expectancy is going down. That should scare people more than it does. We spend so much time fighting each other over culture war nonsense that we ignore the real issue. The rich keep getting richer, the poor keep getting poorer, and the middle class is getting squeezed from both sides. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's math, and yet, despite all of this, the show ends the way it always does, trying to find some sense of normalcy. A reminder about the upcoming live stream. Saturday night, 8 p.m. Central. Opening presents. Playing Christmas music. Drinking hot chocolate. Just being human for a couple hours in a world that feels increasingly inhuman. There will be more content next week. Christmas episodes. A year-end roundup. A full slate of shows because the year is ending, and whether we're ready or not, 2026 is coming. Strong finish. No flawed reports here. So that's it for now. Go get your Christmas shopping done. Take care of yourself. And we'll see you next time on Coravanta. It's important to step back for a moment and look at everything we've been talking about through a wider lens, because none of this exists in a vacuum. The Blake Lively and Baldoni situation, the media reaction, the settlement optics, even the way certain actors positioned themselves publicly, all of it follows a pattern Hollywood has used for decades. Courtrooms matter, but they are rarely where the real battle is fought. The real fight is over narrative, timing, and perception, especially when a case involves public figures whose reputations are part of their economic value. The court-ordered settlement talks don't signal reconciliation. They signal procedure. Judges often require these meetings not because they believe a deal will happen, but because they need to show on the record that an opportunity for resolution was provided. If the case goes to trial and eventually appeal, that box has been checked. That's the practical reality. Emotion doesn't factor into it. What makes this case unusual is the power dynamic. Typically, plaintiffs leverage settlement pressure by threatening prolonged litigation and reputational damage. Here, that leverage appears weakened. Blake Lively carries the burden of proof. Baldoni does not have to prove innocence, he only has to challenge credibility and consistency. Once he put his response into the public domain, the usual incentive to settle quietly diminished. Settling now could look less like pragmatism and more like retreat, and that perception matters when your name and career are on the line. Media behavior around the case is another layer worth examining. When actors or industry figures claim neutrality but selectively amplify one side of a dispute, audiences notice. Silence can be as loud as speech. Sharing one narrative while ignoring another creates an imbalance that people instinctively question. That's not cancel culture, that's pattern recognition. Viewers today are far more media literate than they were even 10 years ago. The Brandon Sleena situation highlights how professional self-interest often gets reframed as moral positioning. Loyalty in Hollywood is rarely ideological, it is transactional. Career momentum, access, and future casting all shape public behavior. When those motivations become visible, backlash follows, not because audiences are cruel, but because they feel manipulated. The same dynamic appears outside entertainment, which brings us back to the Brown University shooting and the role Reddit played in advancing the investigation. That case underscores how decentralized information gathering has become. Institutions still hold power, but they no longer monopolize it. A single civilian observation, shared in the right place, can influence outcomes once reserved for formal channels. That shift is both empowering and destabilizing, especially for systems built on controlled information flow. The Epstein files delay fits neatly into that framework. The issue is not just what is in the files, but how long they are withheld. Delay softens impact. Attention erodes. Public pressure disperses. When information finally emerges, it lands in a quieter environment. That strategy doesn't erase facts, but it changes how those facts are received. In modern politics, timing can matter as much as truth. Economic reporting faces a similar trust deficit. When official data contradicts lived experience, credibility suffers. People don't analyze inflation through spreadsheets, they analyze it through grocery bills, rent increases, insurance premiums, and credit card statements. Once trust in data breaks down, people turn either cynical or extreme. Nuance disappears. Healthcare tourism is another symptom of systemic failure rather than individual choice. When citizens seek medical care abroad not for luxury but affordability, it signals a structural problem. That problem isn't ideological, it's practical. Systems that price out their own middle class inevitably face resentment and reform pressure. Culturally, celebrity trials and documentaries serve as both distraction and entry point. They draw attention, generate emotion, and keep audiences engaged. But beneath that surface, they often expose deeper questions about power, accountability, and inequality. That's why these stories resonate beyond gossip. They reflect anxieties people already carry. This is where a show like Courtroom finds its footing. It uses high-profile narratives to lead into broader conversations about institutions, incentives, and credibility. Blake Lively isn't just a person in a lawsuit, she becomes a case study. Epstein isn't just a scandal, he represents systemic protection of power. Economic data isn't just numbers, it's trust versus reality, and at the end of all of it, people still look for moments of normalcy. A live stream. Music. Shared rituals. Not because the problems go away, but because humans need pauses to process them. That balance between scrutiny and relief is what keeps long-form commentary relevant. This part exists to provide context, not conclusions. These stories aren't finished, and neither are the systems they expose. What matters is recognizing the patterns while they're unfolding, not years later when hindsight feels safer.